Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. This is episode 344. It's Panfish Fly Gear Part 2. Panfish Fly Gear Part 2. So if you are at all curious, yes, there's a Part 1. It came out last week. And I want to talk a little bit about how the sausage gets made here at Casting Across, the fish sausage. Doesn't sound very appetizing, but I suppose if you had the right kind of condiments, it probably would work. So I like to have a general outline of what I'm going to talk about each week on the podcast. That's essentially been the case for 300 of the last 344 podcasts. Every once in a while, I'll have a more detailed agenda of what I want to talk about. Sometimes I will have guests on, as you know, when every 50 episodes, which means that we're actually drawing very close. In about 6 weeks, we'll have some guests on the episode. Sometimes I will actually just go through old articles in the Casting Across archives, but I like to keep it a little bit less structured. First of all, I think it fits the time parameters a little bit better. Secondly, I do want it to be a little more casual. One of the things that I think is a barrier to entry for some folks in fly fishing is the technical side of stuff. And so I like to use words like stuff, and I like to try to distill things down into bite-sized chunks and at the same time give people enough of a knowledge base that they can go and find the answers elsewhere. So all that to say, I try to keep it relatively loose. I also try to keep the banter to a minimum. And I know that's sometimes fun, and I enjoy listening to that, but I'm going to keep it relatively tight. So all that to say, last week I had my outline for the 5 or 6 things I was going to talk about with Panfish Fly Gear. And I was watching my recording app, and I got to about 16 minutes, and I'd only gotten through half of them. So guess what? I knew what I was going to talk about this week. But that led to some cool things. First of all, I got some feedback from some folks in the Casting Across audience, including some people that are very, very well versed in fishing for panfish with fly fishing gear. And so today's recommendation is a direct response to last week's podcast, and it is a fly line suggestion from none other than Mr. Panfish on the Fly himself, Bart Lombardo. So hang tight, and at the end of this podcast, I will give that gear recommendation, and you can have something to check out if you are a panfish angler who's looking for the perfect fly line for that new setup that you have or the setup you've been using, and you might want to take it to the next level. So last week in Panfish Fly Gear Part 1, I talked about rods, I talked about reels, and I talked about line. So I'm not going to go into too much detail with those today, except for where it is appropriate with some of the other things that I am talking about. But the first thing I want to dive into is your fly box. Now, I think that if you have a well-stocked trout fly box, you're going to do great when it comes to fishing for panfish. The streamers, the dry flies, and the nymphs that you have in that trout fly box are going to catch all manner of panfish. In fact, I would take the trout fly box, the one that's well stocked, over kind of the generic panfish fly assortment that you get if you were to order the panfish fly assortment. So what do I mean by that? If you go on maybe like Bass Pro Shop or Cabela's, and nothing against Bass Pro Shop or Cabela's because I use them as much as I need to, and I certainly like to patronize smaller fly shops, but I like to just have the option to do what I need to do. But if you get like the panfish fly assortment, you're probably going to get more poppers, maybe 2 sliders, and then a couple of streamers. And they're going to catch fish, but they're not going to catch as many fish as a robust box of trout flies. So we'll talk about what that looks like in detail as we go through some of the fly items that you should be paying attention to if you are targeting panfish. But know that you can probably start with what you have. So in the same way that your kind of medium trout rod is going to work, and your trout reel is going to work, and your trout line is going to work, and your trout leader and tippet are going to work, your trout flies are going to work also. I would actually say that your flies are some of the least important things if you have a good assortment of trout flies. Now, again, that probably is to the detriment of the popper, which is one of the most exciting flies to use for panfish. But I think that like across the board, although it's really fun to cast and to fish a small popper, there's a lot of fish that probably aren't going to respond as well to that as they are to, say, like a Chernobyl ant. So a foam ant with a little bit of body is going to land with the same splat. It is going to displace a similar amount of water, and it's also going to have those passive fishing elements that a popper is going to have. So what do I mean by those things? So when it comes to an aggressive topwater fly that you are using to pursue panfish, it should do a few things. One is that it should splat when it lands. So you think about a cup-faced popper, even if it's a little one, like a size 8, when that thing hits the water, it's going to cause a splat. It will cause that fish to look up. And that is a fantastic way to trigger some aggressive strikes. But a Chernobyl ant is going to accomplish essentially the same thing. That big foam body is going to land with a loud plop. Secondly, it is going to displace water. Now, Chernobyl ants and most terrestrials are not designed to be stripped, but in some times is actually a benefit for a subtle approach on the top of the water. So I almost call this one a wash. It really depends on what you want to do, what kind of attraction you want for the fish you're fishing for. That panfish popper is going to create that little popping sound if it has that cup face, or if it's backwards, it's going to displace some a significant amount of water. But if all things being equal, that size 8 Chernobyl ant and that size 8 slider or that size 8 popper where the cup face is reversed are probably going to displace the same amount of water. And then the third element, so first you have the plop, I'm sure there's a more technical word for it, the landing effect, I guess. Secondly, you have the displacement of water. But thirdly, you have the passive fishing aspect of that surface fly. And that is the rubber legs that are dangling. That is the hackle or the tail feathers that are moving in the water. That is just as deadly as that popping action or that splat. All three of those things matter, and all three play an important role. And in fact, I think for very wary panfish, unless it is like right post spawn, or if you just catch them in the right mood, I like to have an approach that gives me the option of doing more with that fly when I'm making my presentation than maybe a popper will allow. So I like to, watch my fish. We'll talk about watching fish here in a second. But I like to be able to make that cast and to manipulate that fly in such a way that I can watch that fish, watch that fly, see what is getting that fish going. So what is causing it to flare its gills? What's causing it to really start moving its pectoral fins? What's causing it to, sit still in the water and watch? What's causing it to move up in the water column? What's causing it to maybe drift back down? And I can adjust my presentation to that fish's cues. And honestly, I think that something like a Chernobyl ant is going to give me more options than that popper. Now, I fish poppers all the time, but I guess this is really to say that if you have a bunch of big terrestrials or even flies like stimulators, or a big humpy for that matter, any big stonefly pattern, those cicada flies that you're maybe fishing if you're in certain parts of the country where the cicadas are coming off, that's going to accomplish a lot of the same thing. Now, I will say one of the benefits of a Chernobyl ant is that it is a foam body, which gives you that same floating benefits that something like a popper, whether it be cork or rubber or foam, is going to give you. And I'm a big fan of fishing foam. I think that foam can be trimmed so that it can be subtle. Foam can also be left a little bit more chunky so that it is a more robust pattern. And it's going to happen in a way that is a lot easier to work with than with deer hair and certainly with other natural materials. So that said, if you have a panfish fly box, you're going to have surface flies of all kinds. You're going to have poppers of different shapes with different cup faces. I like fishing completely flat ones. I like to just carve up corks and use that completely flat wine cork face as a popper face. Then, of course, there's the traditional cup ones. Turn them around, they're sliders. Then you have the gurgler patterns that displace water in a really, really effective way while at the same time keeping that fly high up in the water. And that's one thing that, maybe a Chernobyl ant would not do super well if it's tied in a traditional sense. It's going to dive a lot more than it's going to stay on the surface of the water, especially if it's further out and you're making those strips. A lot of times you can compensate for that stripping along, whether it be a caddisfly or whether it be a terrestrial, by keeping that rod tip nice and high, causing that fly to skate across the surface. A very, very effective presentation for trout, in fact, is skating flies, and you can do the same thing for panfish. It is from their perspective, it's a much less aggressive approach. But all I have to say, in that box, you have all those different surface flies, like pencil poppers, something with a little bit of a longer body that's going to create a louder splash. But then getting into the terrestrials, I like to have ants, I like to have crickets, I like to have grasshoppers on hand, because panfish are not, sub trout in the sense that they are not paying attention to what is falling into the water. If there are a lot of grasshoppers that are in those the streamside vegetation, the panfish are going to be queuing in on those, so you need to be ready for that. And then I like to have a good assortment of just dry flies. Everything from the aforementioned stimulators, which are going to give you that nice high riding, high floating, easy to see silhouette, all the way down to little parachute dries into like size 14 and the like. Because there's times where a subtle presentation is going to be what those fish are keying on. If there are mayflies that are emerging, and of course mayflies are completely content to be in the super pristine, rocky bottom, trout stream, and they're also going to be in that muddy bottom bluegill pond, and so you're going to be able to fish with those patterns. So I don't necessarily have every color, every size, every life stage of mayflies, but I do like to have some parachute Adams and some parachute sulfurs on hand so that I can make a much more delicate presentation if those fish are looking up, but they're doing so in a very tentative manner, or they are specifically targeting those those mayflies. So just to have a nice, well-rounded surface fly box is a really, really important thing. I mentioned the triangle bug last week, a Bart Lombardo tie, and he sells a little kit where you can make these. These flies are great because they are designed to be fast to tie, and they're designed so that they don't get inhaled by bluegill. And they kind of strike that balance of nice plop effect, a good surface disturbance that you can kind of fish aggressively or a little bit more reserved. And then lastly, depending on how you finish them off, rubber legs, feathers, whatever, you can have that passive fishing element. As that fly is just sitting there, that stuff wiggles. All right. So that's the first section. And honestly, a lot of times when we think about fishing for panfish, that's going to be the fly that we turn to the most. But don't just stick to that popper assortment. I love it. I like the little blister packs of poppers you can buy at Walmart, right? But there's a lot more. And I would just say, too, if you're not a fly tyer, this is a great entry point. You can make some big mistakes, but watch a couple of videos on how to tie poppers. This is a great way to build your confidence, and it's a relatively easy entry. Once you have the tools, once you have the vise, there's a lot less that you need to tie panfish flies than to tie trout flies. All right, that's the first segment of my fly box. The second one is nymphs. Now here, again, nymphs of all kinds, but I guess the one thing that would maybe differentiate my panfish nymph box from the trout box is I like to have some really, aggressive nymphs. So I like to have those prince nymphs in size like 8 or 10 with rubber legs. I like to have things with a hot spot. I like to have things with a bright collar. I like to tie in brighter colors that are going to be a little bit more aggressive. That's not to say I'm not going to have a regular pheasant tail in there, because there's sometimes where that's going to be the triggering pattern. That's very, very subtle. But I like to have some more aggressively tied nymphs. Mop flies are a fantastic option. But of course, a lot of times if the panfish bite is a little bit more tentative, if you're fishing nymphs, there's a good chance that's the case. You want that hook to be further back in that fly's body, and that's where something like a mop fly could be problematic. The same thing with a squirmy worm. I like to tie my squirmies and my San Juans if I'm fishing for panfish, so that that hook point is further back and that the body of that fly only terminates maybe a third of a hook length behind the hook point, because I want to take advantage of some of those more subtle bites. But squirmies, San Juans, egg flies, egg patterns are great to have in there. And then your copper johns. I think that is a wonderful fly. And in fact, I think one of the most deadly flies is a copper john with some rubber legs just short rubber legs crisscrossed at the collar of that fly. So it has this shine, it has some passive fishing effect, but it's also going to be a relatively subtle pattern that can get down and get down quickly. And these are the kind of things that you can combine the previous two flies. You can fish that fly as a dropper behind a popper. It is a very, very effective tool. Sometimes that popper will cause that fish to look up, but then it'll see that little crazy prints drifting below, and it will go after that fly because it's a less risky proposition for that fish. I don't know if fish calculate risk, but I think you know what I mean. So surface flies, nymphs of all kinds. I would say that probably comprises a third of my fly, maybe a quarter of my box. So if I have a big fly box for panfish, and I usually try to just carry one because I try to limit myself and not be paralyzed by analyzing what's in my fly box. One fold of that box is going to be surface flies of all kinds. A quarter of it is going to be nymphs, and then another quarter is going to be small streamers. And here's the thing: think of the mouth size and shape of the fish that you are fishing for. This is not to say that you're not going to catch a big bass, that you're not going to catch a big pickerel, that you're not going to find like a really, really big crappie that comes up and takes your fly. But I like to fish smaller bodied streamer flies for my panfish, and I also like to have very relatively small tails. So like I said, when it came to nymphs, instead of having maybe that tail be a half to 3/4 of the length of the hook shank, I like to keep it at like a third to a quarter. So it leads to some really squat looking woolly buggers. It leads to some really squat looking flies. But here's where maybe some more traditional flies are also a helpful way. More traditional streamer flies are a good way to get into fish because yes, you are going to find panfish that fight and strike very aggressively, but I like to have a streamer fly where that fish is going to increase the odds of it hooking up and not taking it so deep. So woolly buggers are a great option. Small clousers are fun to tie and they work really well. And then just kind of, just big, puffy marabou flies that, again, will fish very, very actively. And I would say that kind of along those same lines, kind of straddling that line between a woolly bugger and some other patterns, having things that imitate little crayfish are fantastic. Pulling those things across spawning beds post-spawn is just an absolute killer way to attract fish. And really, like carp flies, so like marabou, eyes, hook, weed guard is an awesome fly to fish for panfish. Even some of the smaller crayfish patterns, I think, are a little bit over-designed, in my opinion, but they work very, very well to stimulate strikes because they look like little crayfish, they look like little sculpin, and they look like just stuff that's crawling along the bottom. And again, depending on the mood the fish are in, they're going to look down a lot more quickly than looking up sometimes. All right, so that's a quick run through fly box, and you probably have 3/4 of those flies in your trout box already. But I just want to reiterate, these are flies that are relatively simple to tie, so keep that in mind. All right, two more pieces of gear that I wanted to mention. One of them is sunglasses. Like I said a moment ago when I was talking about diagnosing how fish are responding to the action I impart in my surface flies, you need to be able to see. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, I'll throw it into this podcast as well. If you have multiple fly rods, you should have multiple pairs of sunglasses because conditions change. I have my yellow lenses for low light, both for eye protection, which is really important if you're throwing big, heavy flies. And relatively speaking, panfish flies are heavy flies, but you also want that eye protection even in low light, and you want to be able to see what's going on under the water even in low light. And then, of course, I like an amber lens for general fishing situations, even when in bright light. And so have those sunglasses and use them because panfish are not shy and they kind of wear their emotions on their sleeves. And so you can watch all of that body language. And once you are kind of used to doing that, you can really put that to your benefit in the way that you both cast to and present that fly to those fish. The last thing I would say, and this is a big expense, and so I just want to, just preface this with saying you definitely don't need this. You can catch lots of panfish from the bank, but you can really, really up your panfish game if you are fishing from a watercraft, whether that's a belly boat, whether that's a kayak, whether that's a canoe. You're talking less than $1,000, but you think about where those fish are going to be. So many of the panfish that you catch are from the shore, but the better approach to them, more often than not, is from the body of water. And so being able to cast to those fish from an inside out perspective as opposed to an outside in, thinking of the water body, is oftentimes a great way to get that fly down to those fish. It's also a way to approach those fish that are holed up in those same locations, but it is up against some brush that you can't get through to make those casts. It's a great way to get to fish that are around islands. It's a great way to fish drop-offs and ledges. And so, again, we're talking about upping your panfish game by having better panfish gear. And I think that watercraft is really a great way to be fishing to more fish and to fishing to bigger fish, because you are going to expose yourself to a much greater segment of the panfish population in any given water body, whether that is moving water or whether that is a pond, because you're able to access parts of that pond or that river that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do on foot. And you're also going to be very, very sneaky if you do that. So I would definitely suggest considering picking up a small watercraft if the water bodies that you fish allow for it. Because, I mean, think about it. Think about if you're fishing a pond and you can access 3/4 of it, 60% of it, whatever, by foot, that other percentage probably has similar shoreline structure, but there's no people that are casting to those fish. And so sometimes fish go where there's less pressure, and sometimes you're just going to find fish that are less pressured and more willing to strike. And so it's definitely worth considering. Again, this is something you can use for anything and everything, not just catching a little bit of a bigger basket of bluegill, but it's something to definitely consider. So that is part 2 of Panfish Fly Gear. There's certainly more things that we can talk about, but that's just a good primer. Again, I thought about making this part of that Cast 1 series of beginner fly fishing information, but I think this is just something that is a good general intel for people who have been fishing for any length of time, for any kind of fish, with the exception of those few hardcore panfish fly fishing aficionados that could definitely give me a run for my money in ability to talk about these things at length. So, all that said, do you have a particular piece of fly fishing gear that you use for panfish that you would never be caught on the local pond without? Let me know. What's your favorite fly? What's your favorite rod? And like I said, here in a moment, I have a fly line recommendation. Let me know, Matthew at castingacross.com. This week on Casting Across, the first article is called Sunfish Synchronicity. And this talks about kind of how a certain time every year I get obsessed with catching the biggest bluegill in the pond. And so that's what this article is about. Obviously, panfish are on my mind. Wednesday's article is actually a video, Believe in Good Fly Fishing Stories. So another Casting Across video book review. You get to see me in my library talking about some of the books that I enjoy. And this week it is The Believer by David Coggins. His more popular work was his first fly fishing work called The Optimist. I really enjoyed The Believer. So if you want to know why I think it's worth picking up, then head over to Casting Across, head over to YouTube, put in Casting Across in the search bar, and subscribe over there. And then you can watch all of my video book reviews. This week's recommendation came directly from Bart Lombardo, Mr. Panfish on the Fly. I don't think he calls himself Mr. Panfish on the Fly, but it was for a fly line. So I will actually tell you what Bart said to me. He said, thanks for the shout out. If you are looking for what I consider to be the best panfish fly line produced today, look into the Texas Taper fly lines by Scientific Angler. Right now, I believe they are only available through Living Waters Fly Shop in Round Rock, Texas. They are the ones that developed it. I've been using the line for a few months now and love it. All right, so Living Waters Fly Fishing in Texas does not have a website. So what I'm going to do is share a link to their Instagram post from their release of this fly line on February 28th. And let me tell you what this is the description of it. It says, this 3/4 heavy line is designed to present delicately at close range and authoritatively deliver flies at a distance. A part of the Amplitude Smooth series of SA lines, scientific angle lines, the Texas Taper is feature-rich with the addition of a 10-foot textured camouflage tip for enhanced flotation and stealth. So it's available in sizes 2 through 8 weight. So there you go. Remember last week I was saying it's hard to find these warm water tapers in low weights? Here you can get it in 2 and 3 and 4. So very exciting. I really appreciate Bart. I appreciate Bart, period. But I appreciate Bart sharing this little bit of intel with us. So I'll put a link to this Instagram post, and you can definitely give Living Waters Fly Fishing a buzz, and they can give you more information on it and probably ship you a box for the right price. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and then rate the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.